Hello everybody. As you can see, today I am not here, but I'm hoping to make this day worthwhile and not a missed day for you. So I'm going to play for you the lecture that Dave gave last year on the same topic, the steps leading towards the Cold War. And while that lecture is happening, you can see me down in the bottom corner to see that I am actually here with you, or at least here on Sunday night in my kitchen, kind of with you today. I'm going to be typing and adding some notes here on the left for you to help you stay up on what I'm talking about, and I've got some images here on the right. So hopefully this helps. I know it doesn't necessarily make up for me not being there, but if it does a little bit to keep us on track, then it's worthwhile. So sit back and take some good notes and enjoy.
Over the next couple days, we will obviously talk about the origins of the Cold War, and we're going to lead us through 8 steps that kind of push the United States and the Soviet Union from being wartime allies, as they obviously were, to being Cold War enemies. So we'll deal with those, but first I want to talk a little bit about the ideological differences between the Soviet Union and the United States. And we've already mentioned some of this, but I want to just run through it really quickly again. The Soviet Union is a communist one-party state. So their economic ideology is that of communism, that the government should own the means of production of society. And politically, they're a one-party dictatorship. So this is no instance that the Soviet Union is not a situation where the communists just simply win elections, and that's why they're running the country. They are the only party in town. And the leader of the Soviet Union at the outset of the Cold War is going to be Joseph Stalin. He's running the Soviet Union from the late 1920s until his death in 1953. And he does not have to face popular elections. All right? He does need, ultimately, the support of the upper echelon of the Communist Party. But, of course, his purges in the 1930s are going to kind of guarantee that that will happen. And then the United States, we're a capitalist, free market, democratic republic. So the United States is hoping in this new world where we are not going to remain isolated anymore in the post-war years, we're hoping in this new world that we can spread ideas of democracy and free market enterprise. And that will lead to global security. That's how you avoid another big war from happening. If more of the world becomes free market and can have business relationships with each other, that's how you keep the world safe. Whereas the Soviet Union, they're looking for internal security from outside threats, namely like Germany, that's threatened them twice in the last few decades. And they see that that security is going to come through the acquisition of territory. Following the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States are the only two nations that could really exert influence over other nations in the world. So they are what we're going to call, from here through the end of the Cold War, the two superpowers in the world. And you would contrast this with, the discussions we've had in the pre-World War I years. Remember we talked about the 5 great powers of Europe, and how there was this notion for the previous century that there was a balance of power amongst these great powers in Europe. Well, now there's only 2. Britain, at the end of World War II, is broke, and their empire is crumbling. India, for example, the crown jewel of the British Empire, will be granted its independence in 1947. Britain just can't hold on to it anymore. France, crippled by World War II, certainly, and their empire is also in danger of crumbling. Immediately after ending the Second World War in Europe, France is going to be sending troops to Southeast Asia to fight against a local army called the Viet Minh. We'll talk about these guys when we get into the Vietnam War era. So they're going to be fighting to hold on to their empire first in Southeast Asia, which they will completely fail at that. They will lose there, and that's why the United States gets involved in Vietnam. And then later in North Africa, they're going to fight to try to hold on to their colony of Algeria, which they will ultimately lose that as well. So really, it's only the Soviet Union and the United States that's left to exert any influence over anybody else. And the Soviet Union wants to exert influence over others so they can better protect themselves. And the United States wants to exert our influence over others so we can kind of create this global security that will lead to a stronger economy for us and, we think, the rest of the world. The United States is in far superior economic position following World War II than the Soviet Union. At the end of World War II does not really damage any American cities whatsoever. We are working at full employment. We are producing for much of the world, at least the Allied powers, during the course of the war. We're doing really well. By the end of World War II, by 1945, the United States produces half of the world's wealth. All right, we are half of the world's gross national product. And the Soviet Union, what's their experience in the war? Devastation, right? They lose more than any other country in the course of World War II. So while we have the superior economic position, the Soviets have the superior geopolitical position and certainly the superior military in terms of at least manpower at this time. Because look where the Soviet Union is. You know, if you want to be heavily influential over Europe, are you in a better position if you're the Soviets or if you're America? Soviets. Certainly if you're the Soviets, because you're right there. And then, as the Soviets liberated Eastern Europe, as they pushed the German army out of Poland, as they pushed the Germans out of Romania, out of Hungary, out of Czechoslovakia, what did they leave behind in all of those countries? Soviet armies, right? So they've got their military throughout Eastern Europe. What's the United States doing with its military at the end of World War II? Bringing them home. We're done. We finished what we wanted to do, right? Defeated Germany, defeated Japan. We want our guys back home. So the Soviets are certainly in a better military position and a better geopolitical position. But we have a trump card up our sleeves. And what is that trump card that we have? Very good. In July of 1945, we developed the atomic bomb. We use them in Japan. And the Soviets don't have it yet. They're going to get it soon, but they don't have it yet. And that's the trump card. Because we feel with one atomic bomb, or with the threat of having many more, that we don't need to put a lot of manpower in Europe. That we can defend our interests in Europe without having great numbers of troops there. I saw a question somewhere? Yeah, Logan.
Oh, I was just going to bring up the point, though, that they do have troops still, like, positioned in Germany.
Sure. We will have troops in Europe from the end of World War II all the way until today. You know, we're still there. But we will never have anywhere near the numbers in Western Europe that the Soviets will have in Eastern Europe, for example. So how do we get to this point from where these two countries are wartime allies to Cold War enemies? And we're going to start talking about the steps leading to the Cold War. And as I said, there's going to be 8 of them. The first one is going to be the collapse of what we call the Grand Alliance. And this comes through wartime conferences. All right, so this is the first step to the collapse of these allies, is these wartime conferences. And we're going to talk about 3 of them that we've already mentioned, but we're just going to go in a little bit more depth. Now, to back up for a moment, we remember that upon the invasion by Germany of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, that's when the Grand Alliance really comes to be. Originally, Britain was on its own, right? Holding out against Germany, the only holdout against Germany. But then Hitler invades the Soviet Union in violation of their Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. And almost immediately, Britain starts sending aid to Russia. And the United States does as well, even before we're involved in the war. Because we had passed what legislation that allowed us to grant weapons and financial help to Britain and other belligerents? The Lend-Lease Act, very good. So we almost immediately, despite the fact that we're not actually fighting in the war yet, we start pumping resources into the Soviet Union. So this is really the beginning of the Grand Alliance. It's solidified, obviously, in December of 1941 with the attack of Pearl Harbor, when we declare war on Japan, and subsequently Germany declares war on the United States. Then we are all in it militarily. But pretty much by June of 41, we can say this is one team here. The United States, Soviet Union, and Britain. But this does not mean they liked each other. There are going to be constant clouds of suspicion surrounding this relationship. And despite the aid that Stalin is getting, he's going to be making almost constant pleas to Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States. He's going to make constant pleas to open up that Western Front. Because, and as we saw from the statistics, Russia is being destroyed by the Germans. They're destroying themselves, fighting the Germans. They need that Western Front open, a true Western Front. Not North Africa, not in the Mediterranean, not hopping into Italy. They need a true Western Front in France. That's what would alleviate the pressure on the Soviet Union. Now we know that Stalin is already a paranoid guy, right? The purges tell us that. You're not paranoid if everyone's really out to get you. And what of course does he think? What's the reason he thinks that that Churchill and Roosevelt are delaying the opening of that Western Front? Yes, ma'am.
Because they want the Germans to kill communists.
Very good. If you can prolong the massacres of Nazis and communists of each other, if you can keep Germans killing communists and communists killing Nazis, that's a good thing for everybody involved. So Stalin feels that, now, the Allies would give different reasons, right? And we talked about these, that you're going to get one chance, it's got to be perfect. You don't have any opportunity to fail, there's going to be no second tries. You've got to make sure the planning and the operations are perfect. But Stalin, in his mind, he just thinks Churchill and Roosevelt, especially Churchill, are just out to destroy him. Right? So we see some cracks in this relationship early on. So we're going to talk about three conferences. There are certainly more wartime conferences than we're dealing with here, but three big ones that are going to be important for our discussion. First, November of 1943 in Tehran. Tehran is the capital of Iran. And this is going to be the first meeting of these three leaders that are going to be known as the Big Three. Winston Churchill there, Franklin Roosevelt in the middle, and Joseph Stalin on the right. And it's at Tehran in November of 1943. And this is already, the United States and Britain have already been fighting and winning in North Africa and are pushing into to Italy. This is where Stalin demands the opening of a true Western Front. And he'll get it, but he's not going to get that until June of 44. But there will be conversation at Tehran about the opening of the Western Front and Operation Overlord. Also discussed at Tehran, which is important for our story, is Stalin's demand for some of that territory that can give him security going forward. What Stalin is going to want is some of Poland. Now we remember at the outset of the war, Stalin got some of Poland, right? That was the original secret agreement with the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. Well, Stalin wants to put that into writing with his new partners, with the Allies. And so what will ultimately happen, and we can see on this map, what you see there are those three colors. The white and the gray that we see on the western, or pardon me, the eastern part. That's the original Poland that existed before World War II. And then the salmon, I guess, pink. This stuff, that's Germany. And this is where we get that divided Poland. This was East Prussia. The Polish were given the Polish corridor so they could have access to the Baltic. What Stalin wanted, it would be talked about at Tehran, and the Allies would agree to it. What Stalin wanted was to essentially shift Poland to the west. Whereas the Soviet Union would be able to take that gray territory on the eastern part of Poland, that would become Soviet. And then Poland would be given all of that salmon-colored stuff that was formerly Germany. So ultimately, Germany would be the biggest loser in this deal, but does anybody in November of 1943 care about Germany losing stuff? Not really. Poland would be somewhat of a loser because they're going to lose in their east while they gain in the west, and then Soviet Union is going to be the big winner in this. But this is an ideological problem for Britain and America. Because back in August of 1941, when Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt met off the coast of Newfoundland and signed the Atlantic Charter. If you guys recall, they each agreed at that point that this would not be a war fought for territorial expansion. This was a war to stop Nazi aggression, not a war for territorial expansion. Right? Because remember, Lauren, what was one of those things that the punishments of Germany in the Treaty of Versailles was the loss of territory, right? So we didn't want to get into that boat again. We just wanted to stop Nazi aggression. But now, with the Tehran Conference and the agreement of Churchill and Roosevelt, now it's going to be about, to some extent, territory, right? The whole fighting of the war in the first place was to protect the sovereignty of Poland. And now Poland's being, to some extent, carved up here. Why would Churchill and Roosevelt go along with this? They have no other choice. Because what do they need more than... If Stalin needs Churchill and Roosevelt to open up a Western Front, what do Churchill and Roosevelt need?
They need Russia to keep fighting.
Very good. They need the country that is going through the worst hell in this war to stay in it. They need the Soviet Union to keep fighting. And maybe if you don't give in to what Stalin wants, and guys, this is why I think these things are so interesting and these things are so worth talking about. And it's so easy to say, oh, we shouldn't have appeased Hitler in 1938, and we shouldn't have appeased Joseph Stalin right here, because that's what we're doing, right? We shouldn't have appeased him here. But what is the reality of what's the pressing moment of November of 1943? Defeating Nazi Germany. What happens if Joseph Stalin says, wait, you're not going to give me anything for these masses of millions of people we've lost? I'm not going to get anything out of this? I'm not going to get any guarantee of future security? Well then, nuts to that, I'll just sign a document with Hitler. Now, I don't know if he would really have done that, but he can certainly threaten. How would you even trust Hitler with another document? But they can't have Joseph Stalin backing out of the war. So fine, you can have that territory, right? But they got to get something out of Stalin. So he's going to promise that, going forward, there will be at least free elections in these new states. But we'll talk about that more in a moment. Now, this isn't going to be easy for the Poles, because what do the Poles think of the Soviets? Not very highly at all. I might have mentioned it briefly when we talked about the Soviet invasion of Poland back in 1939. But one of the darkest events of World War II is going to happen when the Soviets will murder 15,000 Poles. Many of them military leaders, political leaders, the upper crust of Polish society. They'll murder about 15,000 Poles, killed in cold blood in the middle of what's called the Katyn Forest. And they will bury them in a mass grave. And this grave will later be found by the Germans. When the Germans are making their way back through Poland to invade the Soviet Union, they will come across this massacre site. Now, obviously, who do you think Joseph Stalin and the Soviets are going to claim did it? They're going to say the Germans did it. But it only takes a little bit of forensic investigation to see who was firing the guns and ultimately what kind of guns they were, to see who did it. So the Poles aren't any fans of the Soviets. All right? This is going to be a lot of people in here who aren't going to be too happy about this situation worked out, right? It's a problem. But Churchill and Roosevelt need Stalin to keep fighting. Yes, sir?
Where was the original split for Poland between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union?
Germany would get Warsaw, but it kind of skirted around Warsaw a little bit. But you can largely draw it in roughly half. But I don't know the specifics of the line. The Soviets would also make demands on other parts of Eastern Europe that they took in the early part of the war, like the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And Finland. They took some of Finland. They took parts of Romania at the outset of the war. Again, the British and the Americans are going to have to reluctantly agree to give in to Stalin's demands, because they need him to keep on fighting. On the flip side, the Americans and the British would ask Stalin, hey, Stalin, you want us to open up a Western front? Why don't you open up an Eastern front against the Japanese? Why don't you join in the war against Japan to give the Japanese some more to deal with? And Stalin is in no position himself to do this, because he's fighting an existential fight with the Germans. So he says, I will help in Japan once Germany is done. This comes out of Tehran as well. I will help in Japan once Germany is defeated. The final agreement at Tehran is going to be surrounding the need for a new international organization that could provide collective security. So this is going to be the beginnings of a conversation about the eventual United Nations. Obviously, the League of Nations, which technically still exists at this point, the League of Nations has not worked very well. So there's talks about a new international organization that could settle disputes through the idea of collective security. Many nations working together to resolve disputes. So that's the first conference at Tehran in November of 1943. I want to talk about the second at Yalta in February of 1945. The Yalta Conference. And that's actually where that photo came from. The Yalta Conference. Now, February of 1945, the war looks very different, right? What's going on in February of 1945?
Western Front exists.
Okay, the Western Front exists. That started back in June of 44. The Western Front not only exists, it's already liberated France, right? The Battle of the Bulge has been fought. The Battle of the Bulge has been won by February of 1945. What's going on in the East? Germany's being pushed all the way back into Germany by the Soviets in the East. So we've got now the liberation of not only the Soviet Union, but of most of Poland and of Czechoslovakia and of Hungary and of Romania. And in all of those places, the Soviets left their armies behind. So a very different story in 1945. Stalin is in a very strong position now. Because by February of 1945, the writing is on the wall that the war is going to be over. Stalin doesn't have to beg the Allies anymore to open up a Western Front, because they already have. All right? And now Stalin's got his armies strewn across Eastern Europe. So he is in a very strong position. The agreements that will come out of Yalta. First, regarding Germany. Germany will be, these are the 3 Ds, disarmed. Germany will be disarmed. They will lose their army again, military again. Germany will be disarmed. Germany will be denazified. We're going to wash those Nazis right out of Germany. And Germany will be divided. Germany will be divided into 4 zones of occupation, with the Americans and the British and the French controlling the western portion of Germany, and the Soviet Union controlling the eastern portion of Germany. But these divisions were meant to be temporary. This is not a permanent blowing up of the German Republic, right? This is a temporary division. Stalin will also demand reparations from Germany. This should start sounding kind of familiar to the end of World War I. Stalin will demand reparations, of which Russia would ultimately get half of them. So they're going to get the majority of the reparations. Now, the figure is smaller than after World War I. It's going to be about $20 billion after World War II, where it was over $30 billion in 1919 dollars to end World War I. So the reparations are not as harsh, but they're still there, and Russia will get most of them. Regarding Poland, those lines that we just talked about will be solidified. Those lines will be set. That will be the new Poland. So the lines for the new Poland are agreed to, and Stalin will promise free elections in Poland. And when I say free elections, we mean vote for who you want to. Let the people choose. There's going to be a great debate surrounding this, though, between 2 groups of Polish leadership. 2 divided groups of Polish leadership. And this is not crucial, but just hear it because it's going to come up in your reading tonight. In London, there is a group of Polish leadership that has been in exile since the fall of Poland back at the beginning of the war. And these are known as the London Poles. And obviously they're in England, and they're kind of working closely in conjunction with the Allied powers, right? These are the London Poles. Back in Poland, in the eastern part of Poland, are a group known as the Lublin Poles. because we can't make it too different, or that would be easy for history students to remember. So you've got this debate between the London Poles, these Poles in exile who've been kind of running a Polish government in exile since 1939, and then you've got a newer group after the Soviets moved back into Poland called the Lublin Poles. And the Lublin Poles are communists. And obviously in cahoots with the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin. So who would ultimately get to rule the day? So this is going to be a debate that you'll read about a little bit more and you'll hear it. Obviously, who does Stalin want in charge? The Lublin Poles. Who do the British and the Americans want? The London Poles. So there's a debate here. Wars aren't going to solve everything. You would think after all of the horror of World War II that Poland goes through that everybody's going to be on the same page afterwards and is just going to want to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. But no, they've got completely different political ideologies going forward. And this will now be a debate going forward. Also out of Yalta, in addition to promising free elections in Poland, Stalin will promise to offer free elections throughout the rest of Eastern Europe. What a guy. He will also promise to enter the war against Japan, again, once Germany has been defeated, but now he's going to make territorial demands. He's not just going to enter out of the goodness of his heart and in, brotherhood of his alliance. He wants territory out of it. He wants land. And the U.S. and Britain kind of feel like they have to accept, because they still have to finish off Nazi Germany, and then they could use some help defeating the Japanese. And finally, Stalin will agree to join the United Nations. You know, there's more work done on what this international organization is going to look like, so more work done on the United Nations. And it's agreed to at Yalta by the British and the Americans and the Soviets that the United Nations will consist of at least what's called the Security Council. The framework for the United Nations Security Council is drafted. The Security Council is the most important entity of the United Nations. It's the one, if the United Nations is to ensure collective security, it's the Security Council that is tasked with doing that. They're the ones that talk of issues of war and peace. So the Security Council is going to feature, and it's drawn up at Yalta, 5 permanent members. 5 countries that will be members of the Security Council in perpetuity. They will always be there. They were there in 1945. They're going to be there in 2045 if the UN is still there. And these 5 permanent members will not only always be on the Security Council, but they will also enjoy veto power. Which means if 4 members want to do one thing, if 4 members think you should use their collective militaries to do something, and one guy disagrees, he can veto it. The 5 permanent members on the Security Council are the United States, you can just write USA, Britain, you can just write UK, Soviet Union, USSR, France, and anyone want to take a stab at the 5th? China. Very good, China. Those will be the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Beyond that, there are rotating members, but those will be the 5 permanent. And those permanent members have veto power. What could possibly go right? Right? So essentially we're going to deal with a Cold War where the United Nations can't really do much of anything because the Soviets can always veto what the Americans might want, and the Americans can always veto what the Soviets might want. Yes, sir?
China, where were they at this point?
They're always over here.
No,
China was fighting against the Japanese throughout the course of the war, obviously being destroyed by the Japanese, not doing well against the Japanese, but the Japanese never completely take over China. So China is actively fighting against the Japanese throughout the course of the war. So they are a very important ally, especially in the war against Japan. That's probably a good reason why they're given this allotment. Also, they're a massive,
And historically, they're one of the superpowers.
Historically a superpower, obviously not in that position anymore, but still a massive population, a viable economic ally to have. So China's included on this Security Council. One interesting side note, in the General Assembly, the United Nations General Assembly. This is the big meeting where all of the countries get to take part, right? You would think it would be one country, one vote on the General Assembly. But Joseph Stalin made an interesting play. He said the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. It's not just one country. It's a union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Each one is its own republic. And so we should each get our own vote on this Security Council. The Soviet Union should have one, but then the 15 republics of the Soviet Union should have them as well. So Russia should get one, Kazakhstan should get one, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, Uzbekistan, Georgia. They should each get their own vote on this General Assembly. Now, can you imagine how that would work? If right off the bat you got America getting one vote on the General Assembly and the Soviet Union essentially having 16 votes. That could be a little bit of a problem. That would not be agreed to by all the parties. But what Stalin would still get 3 out of it. So Stalin gets a vote in the General Assembly of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So they're still going to get 3 votes out of the deal, and then they still have the seat on the Security Council. So the Soviet Union starts off in a pretty good position in this new United Nations. Why? Why give all this into him? Because they need him. The war's not over yet, and he's got his army all over Eastern Europe. Let's keep Joseph Stalin happy. Or maybe appeasement isn't a good idea. I don't know. You can decide. I'm going to stop that for today. I think that's enough for us for today. We've got one more wartime conference to tackle, and that is the Potsdam Conference. That's July of 1945. That one's going to look very different, so we will deal with that at our next meeting.
Good stuff, guys. I hope you are all still with me. Let's throw out a couple review questions and see what you guys got out of that first chunk. Where was the first wartime conference that the 3 leaders of the big 3, or pardon me, 3 leaders of the Grand Alliance first met each other? Nah, just shout it out. Excellent job. Okay. How about this one? Where did this atrocity happen? Where did this atrocity happen? This is where the Soviet Union killed upwards of 15,000 or more Polish political leaders and intelligentsia and police and military officers. Where did this massacre happen? The Katyn Forest, Katyn. And let's do one more before we move on. We said this is going to be the new Poland, where the pink stuff is going to go over to Germany, the gray stuff is going to become the Soviet Union. There's going to be a debate as to who's going to be in charge of this new Poland. And the debate was between a group known as the London Poles, which was made up of the Polish government in exile in London throughout the war, and what other group of Poles that had remained in Poland through the war and were supportive of the Soviet Union. Yep, there it is right there, the Lublin Poles. Excellent. All right, stay tuned, and I'm going to talk to you about Potsdam, and then we'll be done for the day.
So, July of 1945, we have the Potsdam Conference. And as we said, there's some big changes since Yalta. We've got new leaders. Roosevelt is replaced by Truman. And Truman is going to take a much harder line against the communists and against the Soviet Union and against Joseph Stalin. He's going to take a harder line just because of his very nature. He's also going to take a harder line because of what has transpired between February of 45 and now July of 45. So Truman's going to be there. And we mentioned Clement Attlee will replace Churchill. But we've also got some changes in the nature of the war. By July of 45, the war in Europe is over, right? VE Day was May 8th, 1945. So the war in Europe is done. Germany surrendered. And the Soviets have Berlin. All right? They were the ones that got there first. Remember from earlier we talked about what was going to be the outcome for Germany after the war, and this was decided earlier. It was going to be those 3 Ds. Denazification, demilitarization, and then a division amongst the four powers. And at Potsdam, it will be decided that that division that was agreed upon earlier is going to be, these separate parts of Germany will be run essentially individually. The Soviets will control the Soviet sector the way they see fit, the British sector, the American sector, etc. And you can also see that Berlin, completely within the Soviet sector, is itself going to be divided amongst those four powers. There are to be economic relationships between East and West. For example, the eastern part of Germany is much more important with regard to agricultural production. The western part of Germany is much more important with regard to industrial production. So they were supposed to trade with each other. But beyond that, these were to be independently supervised zones. But this was not a permanent division. This was never intended to be what Germany would look like forever. Just the idea that when these two sides can again stand on their feet in a stable nation, then they'll be put back together. For Poland, if we recall the discussion about Poland, and you can see on this map as well, that's the Polish flag there on the right, the white on top, red on bottom. Poland is going to gain some German territory, part of East Prussia, and then the former eastern portion of Germany. Poland's going to gain that territory. This was agreed to back at Yalta and discussed back at Tehran as well. Poland is going to gain some territory. The Soviet Union is going to gain some territory. Poland does this shift to the west. But remember, what did Stalin promise that Poland would get?
Free elections.
He did those free elections, right? And by July of 1945, what happened in Poland since February looks like nothing like free elections. All right? Truman is not satisfied that Stalin came through on his side of the bargain. Because Truman would say, how can there be free elections when the Soviet army is strewn throughout Poland? People don't feel free to vote for whom they really want to. And so those Lublin polls will be running the show. Truman is not going to accept that new government that's dominated by Lublin Poles. And in Eastern Europe, all of those other countries that were liberated by the Soviet Union, that Stalin as well said he would allow free elections to take place. Again, how can you have free elections when there's a threatening Soviet army in each one of those countries? Concerning Japan, we recall that the discussion throughout the war was, both in Tehran and at Yalta, was for the Soviet Union to help out the fight in the Pacific, the Japanese fight, as soon as Germany was done. Well, now Germany's done. So you would think the Americans and the British would want the Soviet Union to go help out against Japan. But now we change our tune. We do not want the Soviet Union to help out with Japan by July of 1945. Because by July of 1945, there's a couple things happening in the Pacific War. One, we know we're getting pretty close to winning. July of 1945, we have island-hopped our way, certainly close enough to Japan, to bomb Japan mercilessly. So all the firebombing that happened, the firebombing of Tokyo was back in April of 1945. We have destroyed almost every major Japanese center. And it's during the Potsdam Conference that Harry Truman gets the notification that our nuclear test, our first atomic bomb test, was successful. So now we have this trump card in the atomic bomb. So we know that we can end the war in Japan very quickly. So we don't encourage the Soviet Union to get involved. Because we know, what does it mean for the Soviet Union to get involved? What have they already demanded back at Yalta?
More land.
We will get involved, but we're going to take land. We're going to take territory back from Japan. So we don't want that to happen because we know, as evidenced by Europe, as far as the Soviets reach, where their boots go, they're not going anywhere. They're staying. They're either taking it over outright, or they're going to tinker with the elections in those territories, and they're going to turn them into communist states. Right? So we don't want the Soviet Union to get involved. But we can't exactly say that. Right? Because we've been fighting a war against Japan. We've kind of solicited the Soviet Union's help for the last 3 years in this fight against the Japanese. So we can't exactly tell them, no, you don't get to help. And the Soviets are more than willing to help at this point, right? They want to enter the war. It's great to enter the war right at the end, right? So you can just kind of scoop up whatever you can. That's what gives us the push to finish this war in the Pacific as fast as we possibly can. And then the final aspect of the Potsdam Conference that we should talk about is that the United Nations will pretty much become a reality. There'll be a later treaty signed called the Treaty of San Francisco that officially creates the United Nations. But essentially, the United Nations are finalized at Potsdam. And the most important thing you guys need to be aware of is those 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And we've already talked about those. U.S., UK, China, France, and Soviet Union. So U.S., UK, USSR, France, and China. And those are in no particular order because no one is any more important than the other. They each get 1 vote on the Security Council and they each hold a veto power of the Security Council. So if 4 nations like something and the Soviet Union doesn't, it can veto it. Or if 4 nations like something and the Soviet Union doesn't, it can be vetoed. All right? I know what you're thinking. What could possibly go right with this organization, all right? And that's Potsdam. Now, a couple nods before we move on to the next step. A couple post-war developments that are going to be taking shape in Eastern Europe that are making us think that this Cold War could certainly be a reality. It could be up and running by this point. The tactics that the Soviet Union is going to employ to guarantee friendly governments in all of these Eastern European states that they have their boots in. And this is where we have the phrase Salami Tactics and the baggage train. Kind of sounds goofy, but something you should be familiar with. You guys familiar with salami? You go to the deli, you see the long salami, and then you order like a half pound and it gets sliced off in little pieces, right? The notion of salami tactics in influencing the political systems of these Eastern European states. We understand that all of these Eastern European governments, when they were occupied or conquered by Nazi Germany, their political systems are in chaos. And then in the aftermath of the war, they've got a lot of people jockeying for control of those countries from a lot of different political ideologies, ranging from the right to the left, right? Well, salami tactics refers to the Soviet-supported slicing off of fringe parties. So, for example, if you've got in Poland, you've got the Lublin Poles, the communists in Poland, the Soviets will support that political group with propaganda coming directly out of Moscow. And they will start calling everybody who's not them, like the radicals on the outside, those people, especially those people to the far right of them, say, what do you think would be the worst word that you could use for any political opponent in Poland or anywhere in Eastern Europe in 1945?
Nazis.
Short of calling them Nazis, fascists. Oh, they're a fascist party, right? And so we start pumping out propaganda to call them fascists. And of course they're not going to get votes, right? So we're going to carve those, we're going to slice those parties off. And then there's, now the communists have an even bigger role in the government. And now the next group that's still there, that's not as far to the right as the previous group you already sliced off, but it's still to the right of you, we're going to call them fascists. And we're going to slice them off. And now you're left with an even more dominant communist party. And ultimately, at the end of this salami tactic, you're left with just one party state, right? Just like the Soviet Union itself. Now, the other phrase that on your standards that goes along with this is the notion of the baggage train. The baggage train in post-World War II politics refers to this collection of Eastern European communist leaders that during the course of World War II, they literally got on trains and went to Moscow. And they stayed the war in Moscow under Joseph Stalin's thumb and under his tutelage. In some cases being wined and dined when that was possible, and in other cases just being influenced. Like, here's how you are going to set up your state. Here's how you are going to run. I am who you are beholden to. And then after the war, these guys that had been kind of tutored in Moscow are going to be sent back to their homes, whether they be Romania or Hungary or Poland. They're going to be sent back to their home nations to lead governments. Right? And then through Salami Tactics, these guys win the day, and they're going to be one-party communist governments in all of the Eastern European states that the Soviet Union liberated. So the Salami Tactics and the baggage train, just methods used to turn Eastern Europe into a communist entity. Now, a couple other post-war issues. One of the first crises, international crises that the United Nations deals with, regards Iran. Remember we said the other day, Iran is right down here. Or maybe I didn't say, I don't think you saw this map the other day. Iran is down here. That's why the Tehran Conference was held where it was, because that's a place that Stalin could get to. Stalin couldn't head to London. Stalin couldn't head to the United States or Canada. Stalin couldn't even get to Morocco for the Casablanca Conference, because the war was going on. His plane couldn't get shot down, right? So in Tehran, Stalin can get there safely. Iran, during the course of the war, has got a lot of oil resources. And during the war, the Soviet Union, which borders Iran, sends its army down, or sends an army down into Iran to defend Iranian oil fields. Right? Then the war ends. What would you think would happen to these Soviet troops?
Let's stay.
Okay, they are going to say, you would think they would go home because the war's done. It's over. Go home. It's over. There's nothing else to do here. And Iran is not a country that was ever taken over by the Nazis. So there was no liberation that had to be done. You know, you don't have to topple any kind or reform any kind of government or anything like that. So just go home, Soviet Union. You're done. But of course, what do we know? Joseph Stalin sees security coming through the holding of territory, and he stays in Iran. The United States and Britain are going to make a call to the Soviet Union saying, hey, Joe, get out of Iran. And Stalin is not going to budge. So here's the first chance for the United Nations to try to do something. And this is discussed at the United Nations Security Council. And obviously there's a big push from everybody but the Soviet Union for the Soviets to leave Iran. And they do at this point. Okay, so the first attempt to stop Soviet aggression in Iran, at least, is pushback. And I think we can write that off to, well, is the Soviet Union going to fight a war over Iran at that point either? Probably not. Probably not. And then if they do stay in Iran, it really looks like it would be plainly evident that they are trying to be an expansionist power. Remember, everything else they're doing in Eastern Europe, they're claiming, like, there's free elections. They're just voting for communists, right? They're freely giving the choice, and they're choosing communists. If they went in Iran and stayed there and wouldn't leave, even then when they were requested by not only British and America, but the Iranians as well to leave, that could be an issue. So they do leave, but we do have a crisis. Got a couple other issues, and you can see it on the map here as well. During the course of the war, Turkey and Greece, down here. Turkey and Greece. Greece was a big part of the war in the Mediterranean. The British were fighting the Germans in Greece. Turkey as well. Each Greece and Turkey have uprisings, small riots and rebellions that the United States believes are being led by communist groups in those two countries. And if you look where they are, Greece is just south of Bulgaria. Bulgaria is a country that the Soviets liberated, and it's turning into a communist nation. So Greece is right there. And then on the flip side, Turkey, it borders the Soviet Union as well. So it's all right in the heart of everything that's happening right now. Both Greece and Turkey are having some uprisings. And the United States feels that those uprisings are being supported by the Soviet Union. That the Soviet Union is trying to orchestrate the toppling of those governments. So we don't like that very much. And then there's concern, now let's get out of Eastern Europe for a second. Let's go to Southern Europe, let's go to Italy, or let's talk about France and Western Europe. Each Italy and France have growing communist parties by 1945. Now, what kind of conditions in a society would lead to things like riots and rebellions and ultimately maybe revolutions? What's that?
Really bad, just everything sucks.
Really bad, everything sucks. Famine, like people hungry, not enough food on the plates. Oppression, people being oppressed or feeling that they're being oppressed.
lack of wealth, like depression in the sense of
Economic depression, poverty, unemployment at extremely high levels. Yeah, being war-torn, right? Like just all around lousy conditions. Well, that's pretty much Europe, right, at this time. Everybody went through the hell of the war. Everybody in Europe is economically depressed at this point. Everybody's a mess. And is there a political ideology that kind of promises to share the wealth of nations and spread it out a little bit more equally amongst everybody that's doing so poorly? Sure. What is that? That's the communist ideology. They're trying to sell that idea. So in war-torn Italy and in war-torn France, you get growing communist parties. And that's scaring us. Because remember, we're fighting, as we said the other day, the zero-sum game. Did I talk about that the other day? For the zero-sum? We're fighting the zero-sum game. Every additional country that becomes aligned with the Soviet Union or becomes a communist nation is one less country that we can have free market enterprise with. Right? So a lot of issues in the immediate post-war